Welcome back to part 2, and now I'm going to show you an example. I've got purple as my background color. I've got a little orange square that represents one sheep. I've got a red square that represents the other sheep. Now you could do any colors you wanted, of course, so if you want an orange sheep, go for it. Now I've got my background color in the round. I'm going to knit to my next color. I'm going to knit till one stitch away. So I'm now one background stitch away from my orange sheep. This is where I'm going to lock in my yarn. I've got my working yarn coming from this side. Again, normally I'd want it on this side, but I've got it coming from this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out 3 times the width of my sheep in yarn. So I'm going to lay it gently across, lay it gently across, and lay it gently across. And I've got about 3 times the width of my sheep. I'm going to pinch it here. Oops. I'm going to pinch it there. I'm going to lay this pinch across my background working yarn right there. I'm not going to knit with the orange. I'm just going to lay it across to pinch it and lock it in to the side. I'm going to knit my last purple stitch, and now you'll see that my orange yarn is caught in the purple. My working yarn is coming from the right, and now I've got this long float. Now it's 3 times, again, the length of this yarn, this float, is 3 times the distance of the width of my orange sheep. This is what I'm going to knit with. So when I say knitting with the float, this is what I mean. I'm going to knit with the float. Try not to split that stitch. Knit with the float, knit with the float, and knit with the float. Now when I get to my last stitch, I'm going to end up with a little bit of extra yarn. Yep, a little bit extra yarn. It's like a little bit too much. We want about 1 stitch's worth of extra yarn remaining. So that's just a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work this back. And most of your sheep in this pattern are about 6, 7, 8, 9, I think 13 at the most stitches wide. So working this yarn back is not too difficult. Just with my fingertips, I'm going to work this yarn back, not too tight, keep it nice and evenly tensioned. When I get back to the last stitch, I use my working yarn and take up the slack. Okay, so I've got 5 perfect stitches. I've got about 1 stitch's worth remaining. I'm at my first purple stitch. Now here's a tip for stranding. When I strand this purple across the back of another color, this orange, I place my middle finger over that other color. I knit my stitch. And do you see how my middle finger is holding up that float? Gives it a nice loose float in the back. You always want really loose floats. A too loose float is better than a too tight float. Too loose and it just hangs out. Too loose and it'll make your fabric pucker. So 1 stitch, okay, again a nice loose float on the purple. Now what I do is I take up that, it's a little hard to see, that little loose loop, and I'm going to loop my working yarn of my purple through it, not run it through it like with a needle. I'm just going to loop it through. Okay? I'm going to loop it through. Okay, so I've got my, again, this is my working yarn. I've got this loop. I'm going to knit my second stitch with that loop. Okay? Now I'm going to drop that loop, take up the slack with my working yarn, and you see how that loop went through? This is that last kind of locking loop. And now my purple background stitch goes through, yarn goes through that, and then I can knit normally to my next Intarsia section. And I'll show you that again in the red. But let's look at the back of the orange. So what I've got here is I've got a working yarn with a loop. I've got my stitches knit across, and then I've got that last loopy stitch, which is my locking stitch, and I've got that looped and locked into the background stitch 1 stitch away from the orange sheep. So what this does is it prevents them from being a hole on either side of the orange. If you just looped it here instead of looping it over here, you'll end up with a hole. Let me show you down here. See that hole? You don't want that. You don't want that on the side of your sheep, because when you're wearing the skirt and it stretches, you don't want there to be a hole. But here, where I've put that locking stitch in, look, there's no hole whatsoever. Same thing here, where I've put this locking stitch in. There's no hole whatsoever. Okay, so let's look at that one more time. I've knit with my background color. I've knit with my background color up to 1 stitch before my red sheep starts. I'm going to take my red yarn. I'm going to measure out 3 times the distance of the width of my sheep. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, 3 times the distance. I'm going to pinch that little section. I'm going to lay that section over my background yarn right there. Okay, see that? I've got that right there. I'm going to knit my last stitch that locks in that red yarn. See, the red yarn is locked in. My working yarn. I've got my loop. My loop is my float. I'm going to knit with my float, and by knitting with my float, I bring the working yarn essentially back over to the right hand side of my design, so that on the next row I can knit, typically. I don't need to worry about this float process on the second, or I guess every odd row, so the first, second, first, third, fifth, etc. So now, oh, I've got not enough yarn. No problem. I'm going to feed back a little bit of yarn from my working yarn side. Feed back a little bit yarn, feed back a little bit more yarn, and now I've got plenty more float to be able to complete my last 2 stitches. So last 2 stitches, last 2 stitches. Whoops. Now again, I've got not enough to do my locking stitch, so I'm going to feed back just about enough to do my last locking stitch. So when I feed this back, it's very easy to do, either to give you more yarn or to reduce your yarn. So I've got my last locking stitch. Okay, so this is enough. Again, you want just about as much as 1 stitch's worth to do my last locking stitch. So I'm going to bring the purple back over. I'm going to do my stitch. And then this is where I want my locking stitch, right? So I'm going to bring it out. I'm going to loop right here. I'm going to loop my working yarn through it, my working background stitch yarn through it. I'm going to use that background stitch loop to knit that stitch. Take up the slack. So I've locked my stitch in, and then finish my row. I'm going to sort all my yarn through the back, and there you are. No holes. The yarn is now in the correct position for the next side, and that's how you do Intarsia in the round. Feel free to ask me any questions. PM me on Ravelry is usually the best way to get an answer from me. And I hope you have a wonderful time knitting your Build Your Own Barnyard Skirt. Thanks. Bye.